You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
Julia lives on a quiet suburban street, peaceful and predictable, until a mysterious neighbor moves in across the way. He never leaves his house, yet strange deliveries arrive under the cover of night. As Julia's curiosity deepens, her neighborhood slowly starts to change. Friends and neighbors become distant, behaving as if someone else entirely has taken their place. Soon, Julia finds herself tangled in paranoia, unable to determine what's real and what's imagined. Is her quiet neighbor hiding something sinister, or is Julia losing her grip on reality? If you love spine-chilling suspense, shocking twists, and stories that blur the line between paranoia and truth, subscribe now to Soul Studios, where the quietest neighborhoods hide the darkest secrets. Julia's breath fogged the cold glass of her bedroom window as she peered out into the midnight gloom. Across the street, a hulking delivery truck idled with its lights off. It was nearly 2 a.m., far beyond normal hours for mail, yet 2 men in dark coveralls were heaving a long coffin-shaped crate onto her neighbor's porch. The only sound was the low rumble of the truck's engine and the soft thud of wood on concrete. Something is very wrong, she thought, heart thudding like a war drum in her ears. She ducked behind the curtain as the front door creaked open. Out stepped the quiet man from next door, tall, gaunt, and stooped under a baseball cap pulled low. Julia's heart lurched. She had hardly ever seen him outside before. He wordlessly signed for the crate with a gloved hand. The delivery men left without a word, stealing away into the darkness. Why a delivery at this hour? And what on earth was in that box? Pressing her ear to the window's crack, Julia heard a faint scraping as her neighbor dragged the heavy crate over his threshold. A chill traced down her spine, unrelated to the autumn air leaking in. As the truck rolled away, the street fell silent, too silent, as if even the crickets dared not break the hush. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. In the eerie stillness, one thought lodged in Julia's mind. My quiet neighbor is hiding something. Something that arrived under cover of darkness while the world slept. Morning did little to ease Julia's nerves. She stepped outside under a grey sky, clutching a mug of coffee to steady her hands. Across the street, the neighbour's house sat as always, curtains drawn tight, neat hedges, no sign of life. If not for faint drag marks trailing from the driveway to the front door, she might have dismissed last night as a bad dream. But there they were, long scratches on the concrete path, as if something heavy had been hauled inside. In 2 years living on Hawthorne Street, Julia had learned little about the man next door. His name, gleaned from a misdelivered piece of mail, was Arthur Graham. He never waved, never attended block parties, never even put out trash bins for collection. Groceries and packages simply appeared on his porch and empties vanished overnight. Neighbours joked he was a harmless hermit or a tech millionaire with agoraphobia. But Julia wasn't laughing. She'd noticed other oddities. Silhouettes pacing behind his attic window at odd hours, a chemical smell seeping from his garage vent, and of course those late-night deliveries. Julia's stomach swirled with anxiety. What had she really witnessed at 2 a.m.? A secret delivery, hidden away in that house no one ever entered. She lingered on her porch until her coffee went cold, resolve hardening. If Arthur Grant was hiding something, she intended to find out what. For her own peace of mind, she would keep a closer eye on that house, no matter how quietly her neighbor tried to slip under the radar. Over the next few days, Hawthorne Street's pleasant routine began to unravel. Just past dusk on the third evening, Julia spotted Arthur outside, a rare sight. He stood by his mailbox as Ed Thompson, an older neighbour from 3 houses down, marched up to him. Ed's raised voice carried in the quiet. Something about that awful stink lately. Julia held her breath as Arthur listened calmly, then, to her shock, invited Ed inside with a polite nod. Arthur had never been sociable with anyone on the block. Why start now? Ed Thompson did not re-emerge for hours. Late that night, Julia paced by her window, waiting in vain. It was nearly dawn when she finally collapsed into an uneasy sleep. The next morning she saw Ed in his front yard, watering his roses as usual. Relief fluttered through her until she called out, "Good morning, everything okay?" Ed turned his head slowly toward her. He gave a stiff, vacant smile. "Yes, beautiful day," he said flatly, in a tone so unlike his usual jovial banter that it chilled her. There was no warmth or recognition in his eyes. It was as if someone else was behind them. Heart-pounding, Julia hurried next door to Marcy's porch. She found herself whispering, as if afraid Arthur could somehow hear. "Marcy, something's wrong. I saw Ed Thompson go into Arthur's house last night, and now Ed, he isn't himself." Marcy's brow creased with concern. "Julia, you've barely slept lately. Maybe Ed was just tired or upset." Julia shook her head. "No, you didn't see him. It was like he didn't know me. And whatever that smell was, it had him complaining enough to confront Arthur." Marcy rubbed Julia's shoulder. "I know Arthur is odd, but this neighborhood is safe. People can have off days. You might be overthinking things." Her gentle smile faltered when Julia didn't respond. "Just try not to worry, okay? Get some rest tonight." Julia bit her lip and nodded, realizing with a sinking feeling that her only ally thought she was imagining things. By the following afternoon, Julia's anxiety peaked. She called the police non-emergency line with a vague report of suspicious activity at Arthur Grant's address. An officer finally came by that evening. Julia watched from her driveway as Arthur answered the door, all courteous smiles. After a brief conversation, the patrolman approached her with a genial shrug. "Ma'am, your neighbour says Mr. Thompson is visiting family out of town. He even let me look around. Everything appears normal and tidy. Honestly, the fellow seems fine." He offered a polite smile. "Try to get a good night's rest. Stress can play tricks on you." Julia thanked him in a small voice, stomach knotted in frustration. Arthur had smoothly talked his way out, and now the police, like Marcy, assumed it was all in her head. That night, sleep refused to come. Julia left a lamp on and lay curled on her couch, mind racing. Sometime after 2 a.m., a click sounded and the house went completely dark. The lamp, the fridge, everything died at once. Power outage? Julia sat up, every muscle tense. A soft, deliberate tapping at her front door broke the silence. She smothered a gasp with her hand. "He's here." Moving carefully, Julia crept toward the door. The tapping stopped. She pressed her eye to the peephole. Outside, only the empty moonlit street. Then, just as she was exhaling, a shadow shifted at the very edge of the porch and slipped away into the darkness. Julia's blood ran cold. She stumbled back from the door, chest tight with fear. Suddenly the lights blazed on, power restored. In the harsh light, she noticed her living room window was open that slightest crack, and her neat pile of mail on the coffee table was now strewn across the floor. Atop the scattered letters lay something that made her heart lurch, a single Polaroid photograph. Julia snatched it up with trembling fingers. The photo showed her asleep on the couch just minutes ago, bathed in warm lamplight. And outside the window behind her, a dark silhouette loomed, camera in hand, face obscured but unmistakable in its stillness. Her quiet neighbor had been watching her sleep. A strangled cry escaped Julia's throat. She dashed to the door and yanked it open, desperation overriding caution. "Hello?" she shouted into the empty night. No reply, only the chirp of crickets and the distant hum of streetlights. Julia's gaze darted across the shadowed lawns and hedges. Nothing moved. If Arthur was out there, he'd melted away like smoke. Julia shakily locked her door and backed away. The Polaroid clutched to her chest. He had been here, inside her yard, perhaps inches from where she lay. He could have harmed her in a dozen ways, but instead he left a photograph, a message. He was telling her she was utterly exposed and utterly alone in knowing it. Something snapped in Julia. If no one would help her, she'd get proof herself. Before dawn, she pulled on dark clothes and grabbed a flashlight, adrenaline overriding her trembling fear. Slipping out her back door, Julia crept across the lawn into Arthur's yard. The world was silent save for her own ragged breathing. A small basement window on the side of the house was open a few inches. Julia wedged it wider and hoisted herself through. She dropped onto a concrete floor in the darkness, biting back a whimper as her knees jarred on impact. The air was stifling and sharp with the scent of bleach and something metallic. Julia's flashlight beam danced over racks of tools and stacks of boxes. On the floor, those same drag marks she'd noted outside led deeper in. Heart in her throat, she followed them to a heavy interior door left ajar, a sliver of amber light beckoning. Julia eased it open and stepped into what looked like a makeshift workshop. Her eyes widened in horror. Ed Thompson was slumped in a metal chair at the center, wrists bound to the armrests. Duct tape plastered over his mouth muffled his low, unconscious moans. A tangle of wires ran from beneath his rumpled shirt to a humming device on a table. In the corner, a human-shaped figure stood shrouded in a sheet, unnervingly still. And along one wall, dozens of photos of Julia's neighbors were pinned to a corkboard, each labeled in neat marker, prepared, pending, or observing. Under a photo of Julia herself, the word observing glared back. Julia's stomach churned. This was worse than any nightmare. She rushed to Ed's side and tore the tape from his mouth. "Ed!" she hissed. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with confusion and pain. "Help!" he croaked, barely audible. A floorboard creaked behind them. Julia spun around. Arthur stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. His eyes flickered from Ed to Julia. He almost looked sad. In his other hand, a long syringe gleamed with amber fluid. "I wish you hadn't come here, Julia," he said softly. "You of all people should understand wanting a quiet life." Julia backed away, putting herself between Arthur and Ed. Her mind raced, seeking any escape. Arthur stepped forward in a blur, faster than she anticipated. Julia tried to dodge, but pain lanced into her thigh. The syringe stabbed deep. She cried out as her leg went weak, a cold numbness spreading. With a burst of panic-fueled strength, Julia ripped the syringe out and slashed it at Arthur's face. He recoiled, and she seized that single opening to dart past him. Julia barreled through the doorway into the basement, her leg wobbling beneath her. Up ahead, pale pre-dawn light gleamed through the open basement window, the way out. She could hear Arthur's measured footsteps right behind her on the concrete. Summoning everything she had, Julia clawed her way up and through the window, half scrambling, half falling onto the dew-soaked grass outside. She hit the ground and dragged herself to her feet, ignoring the stabbing pain where she'd been injected. Behind her, Arthur's silhouette appeared in the window. Julia didn't stick around to see if he'd follow. She ran, limping, breath hitching, around the side of the house and straight into the street. "Help!" she screamed, voice breaking, as porch lights began flicking on. Her vision blurred with tears and exhaustion. A couple of neighbors emerged from their homes, alarmed. Julia collapsed to her knees on the asphalt. The last thing she saw was Arthur standing at his front door, hands calmly folded, watching the chaotic scene with an unreadable expression as the sky lightened behind him. Then everything went black. Julia regained consciousness in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned faces. When she frantically recounted what she'd seen, no one believed her. The police found Arthur's basement perfectly ordinary and Mr. Thompson alive and well at home. Doctors murmured about stress and hallucinations. Arthur himself stopped by with flowers and a gentle smile, telling Julia he only wanted her to get better. The more everyone insisted nothing had happened, the more Julia wondered if her mind had betrayed her. A day later, Julia returned to Hawthorne Street. Everything looked unchanged. Sunshine, trimmed lawns, neighbors waving hello. Arthur stood on his porch, as polite as ever, and Marcy stayed close, fussing over Julia like a fragile invalid. Julia felt she might scream. That evening from her window, Julia spotted Marcy quietly slip into Arthur's house. She watched, heart in her throat, as Marcy stayed inside for over an hour. When her friend finally reappeared, walking back across the street, Julia peered through the dusk at her face. Marcy looked strangely tranquil, her eyes blank and unaware of Julia watching. In that moment, Julia couldn't tell if this was reality cracking apart or if Arthur had truly gotten to her last ally. That night, Julia sat locked in her home, every light on, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand. She knew sleep would not come. Each creak of the floor or whisper of wind outside set her nerves on edge. Was that a shadow moving in her yard? A figure at the window? Julia realized with dread that whether Arthur had replaced her neighbors or she was descending into paranoia, the effect was the same. She was utterly alone with her terror. In the quiet before dawn, she remembered Arthur's soft-spoken promise, "We neighbors have to look out for one another." Julia let out a shaky breath. On this once idyllic street, the line between safety and horror had blurred beyond recognition, and she would never again trust the smiles next door, nor the sanity of her own mind. In quiet neighborhoods, secrets lurk behind every closed door. Be careful who moves in next door, because once they're inside, they might never leave. Sometimes the friendliest smiles hide the darkest intentions. They moved in quietly. Now they're taking over.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.